Cracking your knuckles causes arthritis. There's a small sound a hand makes when it's bored a knuckle, pulled and released, popping in the quiet. Somewhere along the way, someone decided that sound meant damage. Swollen joints, arthritis, decades early, paid for one knuckle at a time. Here's what's actually happening. Inside every joint there's a thin layer of fluid, full of dissolved gas, mostly nitrogen. When you pull a joint apart, the pressure drops fast, and the gas collapses out of the fluid into a bubble, then collapses on itself. That collapse is the pop. Same physics as an underwater bubble imploding, just smaller, and happening 8 inches from your ear instead of underwater. Doctors have actually tested this directly. One researcher cracked the knuckles on one hand for over 60 years and left the other alone, just to see. Same hands, same body, 6 decades apart in habit. No difference in arthritis between them. So the sound isn't your joints breaking down. It's just gas, doing what gas does when you give it the room. Your hands were never the problem. You lose most of your body heat through your head. Picture a cold night and someone telling a kid to put a hat on because that's where all the heat escapes, as if the skull were a chimney standing open above a sealed house. The truth has a strange origin. In the 1950s, the US military ran cold exposure tests on soldiers dressed in full Arctic gear, every part of them covered, except one: their heads. So naturally, almost all the measured heat loss came from the only skin left exposed. It wasn't that heads were special, it was that heads were the only thing left bare. Your head loses heat in roughly the same proportion as any other part of skin you leave uncovered, about 7 to 10% of your body's heat, matching how much of your skin surface the head makes up. Leave your arms bare in the cold, and they'll lose heat right alongside it. So the old advice wasn't wrong, exactly. Cover what's exposed, and you keep the warmth in. It just was never about the head being a chimney. It was always about what was left open to the cold. Humans only use 10% of their brains. Somewhere, a brain scan glows on a screen mostly dark, a few patches lit, and the idea took hold decades ago that the dark majority is unused brain, switched off, waiting for some hidden trick to flip it on. Brain scans tell a different story. Over an ordinary day, nearly every region becomes active at some point, not all at once, the way a city doesn't light every window at the same hour, but in shifts, the parts handling vision fire when you're looking at something, the parts handling balance, fire when you stand. Even in sleep, regions tied to memory and emotion stay busy, replaying and sorting. There's also a colder argument. The brain is expensive. It burns roughly 1/5 of your body's energy, just sitting in your skull, doing nothing dramatic. Evolution doesn't usually keep a fuel-hungry organ around if 90% of it sits idle for an entire lifetime. So nothing in you is dormant, waiting to be unlocked. It's all already running, just not all at the same instant. The way no city needs every light on to be alive. Goldfish have a 3-second memory, a bowl, a small orange shape circling the same 6 inches of glass, and the comforting idea that it's circling for the first time, every time, that whatever it just swam past, it's already forgotten. It isn't. Goldfish have been tested in mazes, trained to push levers for food, taught to recognize colors and shapes tied to a reward. In one set of experiments, fish trained to associate a lever with feeding still remembered the connection months later, long after any 3-second window could explain it. Some studies suggest they can hold on to a routine, like a regular feeding time, for the better part of a year. The myth probably survives because it's kind. It lets us believe a small life in a small bowl doesn't notice the smallness that nothing is missed because nothing is remembered. But if the research holds, the fish circling that glass may recognize the hand that feeds it, may notice the rhythm of when it's fed and when it's forgotten. The bowl might not be the whole world to it the way we hoped. It might just be the world it's stuck remembering. Swallowed gum stays in your stomach for 7 years, a piece of gum, mid-chew, and the sudden tilt of a throat that swallows before the brain agrees to it. Then the quiet panic that follows the rumor that it'll sit there for 7 years, stuck like cement in the one part of you that's supposed to keep moving. Gum doesn't digest the way food does. That part is true. Your body can't break down the rubbery base it's made from, but your stomach isn't a still pond where things settle and wait. It's a working muscle, squeezing and churning around the clock, pushing everything forward whether it can be broken down or not. So the gum doesn't dissolve. It just rides the same conveyor belt as everything else you swallow, and comes out the other end in a day or two, mostly intact, completely unremarkable. The 7 years probably stuck around because it's a satisfying number long enough to sound like a punishment for a small mistake. But the body doesn't keep score that way. It just moves it along, like it moves everything else, and forgets it as fast as it forgot you swallowed it. Sugar makes kids hyperactive frosting on a paper plate, a kid spinning in circles before the candles are even lit, and a parent already mentally filing it under sugar high. Researchers have actually tried to catch this in the act. In one well-known study, parents were told their child had been given a sugary drink, when in fact half had been given a sugar-free one instead. The parents who believed their kid got sugar rated them as noticeably more wild and uncontrollable. The kids who actually drank the sugar weren't behaving any differently at all. The hyperactivity was in the watching, not the bloodstream. What's really driving the chaos at that party isn't fructose. It's the party itself, the noise, the other kids, the skipped nap, the sheer permission to be loud that a birthday hands out for free. Sugar's only real crime is showing up at the scene of something else's making. So next time a kid bounces off the walls after cake, the cake's not guilty. It's just an accomplice, standing near the actual cause, holding a fork. You need to wait 24 hours before reporting a missing person, a phone on a nightstand, midnight, and a parent who's just noticed a bed that should have someone in it. Somewhere in the back of their mind, a rule surfaces: wait it out, give it a day, the police won't even start looking yet. It feels like procedure. It isn't. No such law exists anywhere. It never has. Police agencies say almost the opposite of what the myth claims. The first few hours after someone goes missing matter more than almost any hour that follows. Trails are warmer. Memories are sharper. Security footage hasn't been overwritten yet. Waiting doesn't protect anyone, it just hands time to whatever's already wrong. The myth seems to have leaked out of decades of crime dramas, where a tired detective waves off a worried caller for the sake of the plot. Said often enough, on enough screens, it started sounding like something true. If you're ever the one reaching for that phone, you don't owe the night a single extra hour. Not one. The call is allowed the second the bed is empty. Lightning never strikes the same place twice, rain hammering a tin roof, and somewhere above it, an old comfort. That lightning visits a place once, leaves its mark, and moves on for good like it keeps a list. It doesn't. Lightning isn't choosing variety. It's choosing geometry, the tallest point, the sharpest edge, the easiest path of least resistance between sky and ground. The Empire State Building gets struck roughly 20 times a year. Same building, same spike pulling the sky down to it, storm after storm, like it's the only door left unlocked for miles. What feels like superstition is actually closer to a rule. Height attracts it. Isolation attracts it. A lone tree in an open field is basically standing with its hand raised. There's something almost steady in that, once you see it clearly. Lightning isn't cruel or random, picking targets out of spite. It's loyal, boringly, mechanically loyal to whatever already reaches highest. It was never holding a grudge. It just never stopped checking the same door. The Great Wall of China is visible from space. A grainy photograph passed around a classroom once, the wall traced over in marker, and a teacher saying with total confidence that you could see it from orbit. Astronauts have said otherwise, more than once. The wall is narrow in most places, barely wider than a 2-lane road, and built from stone and earth that blend almost perfectly into the land around it. From low orbit, it disappears into the same color as everything beside it. Meanwhile, things the wall's builders never could have imagined, runways, highways, entire cities lit up at night, are easy to pick out from the same height. It isn't that the wall failed some test of size. It's that visibility from space has almost nothing to do with how impressive something feels standing in front of it. Scale up high enough, and contrast matters more than length. A wall that took centuries and 1 million laborers to build can vanish into a hillside, while a parking lot glows. Greatness on the ground and visibility from above were never measuring the same thing. Bulls are enraged by the color red. A red cape, snapped open in a ring, and a crowd certain that color alone is what's driving the bull into a fury. It isn't, and it can't be. Bulls don't see red the way we do. Their eyes lack the receptors to tell red apart from green. To a bull, that cape and the grass underneath it sit in roughly the same dull family of color. What's actually provoking it is everything else happening in front of it. The sudden motion, the sharp snap of fabric, the matador's body closing distance, the noise of a packed arena pressing in on all sides. The cape could be any color, and the bull would react the same way. Red was chosen for the people in the seats, not the animal in the ring. It hides blood stains. Well, and it photographs dramatically under bright sun. So the fury in that ring was never about a color at all. It's a performance built for human eyes, mistaking an audience's symbol for the cause of the whole show. You should wait an hour after eating before swimming, a plate scraped clean, a pool glittering 20 feet away, and a parent's hand stopping a kid at the edge. Not yet. Give it an hour, or your stomach will cramp and you'll go under. The image behind that warning is specific. Blood rushing to the stomach to digest, leaving the arms and legs starved and useless mid-stroke. But digestion doesn't pull blood away from your limbs in any amount that matters. Your body runs both jobs at once. Without strain, it's built to multitask far harder than swimming a few laps after lunch. No major health or safety organization has ever actually recommended the wait. There's no recorded case of a drowning caused by recent eating. What can happen is a stitch, a mild cramp from a full stomach, pressing against muscle uncomfortable, but not the leg-locking emergency the myth promises. The hour was never really about the body. It was about patience, a convenient number to make kids sit still on a hot day, dressed in nothing but waiting. Shaving makes hair grow back thicker. A razor pulled across skin, and weeks later, Stubble that feels coarser, looks darker, seems to be growing back angrier than before. Proof, it seems, that shaving woke something up. What's actually happening is simpler and a little disappointing. Hair grows in a taper thin and soft at the very tip, the part that's been exposed to sun and friction the longest. A razor cuts straight across that taper, blunt, leaving a flat edge instead of a fine point. New growth feels coarser only because you're now feeling the blunt-cut base instead of the worn-down tip. Researchers confirmed this directly back in the 1920s, shaving one leg and leaving the other alone for months, then comparing the regrowth. No difference in thickness, no difference in rate. Just the illusion of one, made by a blade that never touched the follicle underneath the skin at all. So nothing was woken up. The hair was never changed, only the part of it you'd been touching all along. Vitamin C prevents the common cold. A glass of orange juice, gulped down at the first scratch in the throat, like loading a defense before the siege even starts. The idea traces back to one very persuasive chemist who believed loudly, and in multiple best-selling books, that megadoses of vitamin C could stop colds before they took hold. Since then, researchers have run the experiment dozens of times across thousands of people. The result keeps landing in the same place. For most people, vitamin C does almost nothing to prevent a cold from starting. What it might do, modestly, is shorten one slightly once it's already arrived. Shave a few hours off a cold that was coming regardless. That's a much smaller promise than the one on the label of every immune support gummy. There's no real harm in the juice. It just isn't the wall it's been sold as. The cold doesn't check your vitamin levels before deciding to move in. It was already on its way. Juice or no juice. The moment you shook the wrong hand 3 days ago. Bats are blind. A shape cutting through dusk on leather wings, navigating in total darkness, and the assumption that it must be flying blind, guided by some sense that isn't sight, because surely nothing could see in that. Every species of bat has eyes, and most can see reasonably well, some better in dim light than humans manage. What makes them remarkable isn't an absence of sight. It's an addition to it. Echolocation lets a bat build a map of a space using sound alone, sending out calls too high for human ears, and reading the echoes that bounce back off a moth's wing, a branch, a wall it's never touched. It's not a replacement for eyes. It's a second system, running alongside the first, for the specific problem of finding a moving insect in pitch dark, where eyesight alone would fail anyone. So the bat isn't fumbling through the night, blind and lucky. It's reading the dark, the way we read a lit room, just through a sense we were never given. The 5-second rule makes dropped food safe. A cookie hits the floor, and a hand snatches it back up before the count even finishes 5 seconds, the unspoken law says, and whatever landed on it hasn't had time to move in yet. Bacteria don't wait for an invitation, and they don't check a clock. Studies that actually dropped food onto contaminated surfaces found that transfer happens almost the instant of contact, sometimes within under a second, depending on the surface and the food. Wet food picks up more, faster, than something dry like a cracker, but the floor was never running on a 5-second delay before deciding to contaminate anything. What matters more than timing is what the food landed on, and what was already living there before it fell. A kitchen tile is a different bet than a sidewalk outside a bus stop. The rule survives because it gives permission. not because it's protective. 5 seconds was never a safety window. It was just enough time to convince yourself the floor was clean before you'd already decided to eat it anyway. Eating before bed makes you gain more weight. A fridge door opened quietly at midnight, and the guilty math that follows anything eaten this close to sleep must count double, must sit and settle into fat, while the body lies still and undefended. Your body doesn't actually check the clock before deciding what to do with a calorie. Weight gain comes down to total calories in versus calories burned over time, not the specific hour those calories were swallowed. A snack at 11 p.m. is processed by the same metabolism, using the same rules, as the identical snack eaten at 11 a.m. What the late hour usually signals isn't biology, it's behavior. Late-night eating tends to be mindless, often in front of a screen, often reaching for things dense in sugar or fat rather than a balanced plate. It's not the timing doing the damage, it's that midnight snacks are rarely a salad, so the fridge light isn't switching on some fat-storing mode the moment the sun goes down. It's just easier, in the dark and half asleep, to reach for the wrong thing and call the hour the culprit. Touching a baby bird makes the mother abandon it. A fledgling on the grass, feathers still half-formed, and a child reaching toward it before someone yanks their hand back. Don't touch it. The mother will smell you on it and never come back. Most birds have a poor sense of smell for the vast majority of species. It isn't sensitive enough to detect a human handprint left on a chick. What actually keeps a mother away isn't scent. It's disturbance if you linger too long. If you're crouched there staring when she circles back, she may simply wait you out from a distance rather than risk landing. In fact, wildlife rehabilitators routinely handle and return fallen chicks to nests, and the parents come right back to feeding them. No hesitation, no rejection over a human touch. The warning probably stuck around because it sounds protective. A reason to leave a fragile thing alone, dressed up as biology. The real reason to leave it alone is simpler. Most birds don't need rescuing at all. They just need the distance to be a few feet. Not forever. MSG is dangerous to your health. A takeout container, and on the label, the quiet absence of 3 letters no MSG added, like the dish is proudly missing something dangerous. The fear traces back to a single 1968 letter to a medical journal describing a vague set of symptoms after eating at Chinese restaurants with no actual testing behind it. Just a guess, printed and repeated until it calcified into fact. Since then, controlled studies, including ones where people didn't know whether they'd been given MSG or a placebo, have failed to consistently reproduce the reaction at all. Major health and food safety bodies worldwide now classify MSG as safe for the general population at normal eating levels. Chemically, MSG is just the sodium salt of glutamate, an amino acid your body already makes and uses constantly, found naturally in tomatoes, parmesan, and seaweed. It's flavor, not threat. What persisted wasn't the science. It was a sound, those 3 letters, foreign enough to seem suspicious, attached early on to one specific cuisine and never properly let go. Antibiotics can cure the common cold. A scratchy throat, a doctor's office, and a hand already reaching for the prescription pad because surely something this strong can knock it out. Antibiotics are built for one specific kind of enemy, bacteria. Colds are caused by viruses, an entirely different kind of organism, with none of the cellular machinery antibiotics are designed to disrupt. Giving an antibiotic for a cold is a bit like sending the right kind of soldier to the wrong kind of war, fully equipped, completely useless, because the target it's trained for was never in the building. Taking them anyway doesn't just fail to help. It carries its own cost. Overuse has driven the rise of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, strains that no longer respond to drugs that once worked easily, a problem that grows a little heavier every time the wrong prescription gets filled. A cold runs its course on its own, usually within a week or two, no matter what's swallowed alongside it. So the pill in that scenario isn't a cure. It's just a placebo with side effects, treating a war that was never bacterial to begin with. You swallow 8 spiders a year in your sleep, a dark bedroom, a still body, and somewhere above the pillow, the unsettling rumor that something 8-legged might wander across a sleeping mouth and end up swallowed before morning. Spiders have no reason to want anywhere near a sleeping human. A mouth, breathing rhythmically, radiating warmth and vibration, is one of the more dangerous places a spider could choose to walk. Vibration and breath read to a spider as threat, not invitation. Their entire survival strategy depends on avoiding exactly that kind of disturbance, not climbing toward it. There's no recorded study, no actual data anywhere behind the number 8. The figure seems to have originated as a deliberately invented fact, created specifically to test how easily fabricated trivia could spread once typed up and shared as though it were real. It worked exactly as well as whoever made it up hoped. So nothing is creeping towards your mouth in the dark, drawn by warmth. If anything, you're the last place in the room a spider would choose to go. Adults stop growing new brain cells. Somewhere in the back of the mind, an old belief sits like settled dust that the brain you're handed in childhood is the brain you keep, and every year after that is a slow subtraction. Neurons die, none replace them. You're working with less every birthday. The picture is older than the evidence. Research over the past few decades has watched new neurons appear in the adult human hippocampus, the region most involved in memory and learning, well into old age. The process is called neurogenesis, and while it slows compared to childhood, it doesn't stop. Brains in their 70s have been found still quietly producing new cells year after year. What encourages it isn't mysterious. Exercise, sleep, learning something genuinely new. Social contact, the things that already feel like living well, happen to be the same things that keep new neurons forming. What suppresses it is also familiar. Chronic stress, isolation, alcohol. So the brain you're using right now isn't a sealed inheritance, slowly running down. It's still under construction, quietly, modestly, but really. Whatever's being learned tonight has somewhere to land. Tongue has specific zones for tastes, sweet, sour, etc. A diagram in a school textbook. Tongue split into colored regions, sweet at the tip, bitter at the back, sour along the sides like a map of small countries, each one handling its own flavor. The map traces back to a German researcher's work in 1901, which found slight differences in sensitivity across the tongue, small, real, easily overlooked. When the work was translated into English decades later, those modest variations got flattened into rigid zones, drawn into textbooks, and turned into a tidy illustration that stayed in classrooms for most of a century. The actual tongue doesn't work that way. Taste buds, capable of detecting all 5 basic tastes, sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami are scattered across the entire surface of the tongue. Every region can taste every flavor. There are tiny differences in concentration in some areas, but no neat borders, no specialist territories. A simple test ends it instantly. Put something sweet on the back of your tongue, where the map insists you should only taste bitterness. You taste the sweetness. The map was never the territory. It was just a translation that got too confident. The Coriolis effect determines which way your toilet flushes. A vacationer leaning over a bowl at the equator, watching water swirl one way, then crossing a painted line and watching it swirl the other, a small magic trick performed by the planet itself. The Coriolis effect is real, and it does influence the rotation of large weather systems, hurricanes and ocean currents, things massive enough and slow enough for the Earth's spin to noticeably bend their motion over hours and miles. A toilet bowl is none of those things. It's small, the water moves through it fast, and any rotational nudge the planet provides is dwarfed by the actual factors at play: the angle of the jets, the shape of the basin, whatever motion the water carried before you flushed. You can find toilets in the northern hemisphere that flush clockwise, and toilets in the southern hemisphere that flush either direction or neither, depending on the plumbing. The equator demonstrations sold to tourists rely on subtle tricks: the demonstrator's hand moving around the basin, the angle they pour the water from. The trick isn't the planet. It's the wrist. Diamonds form from compressed coal, a lump of black coal in one hand, a glittering diamond in the other, and the satisfying story between them that one becomes the other under enough pressure, given enough time. Carbon to carbon. Simple as that. Coal and diamonds do share an ingredient, but the path between them isn't real. Coal is formed from ancient plant matter, compressed in the upper layers of the Earth's crust. Diamonds are formed far deeper, over 90 miles down, in conditions of heat and pressure that no coal seam ever reaches, from sources of carbon that have nothing to do with prehistoric ferns. Most diamonds are also older than the first land plants by hundreds of millions of years, which means they formed long before coal had any plant matter to make from. The myth survives because its clean pressure transforms ugliness into beauty, suffering into worth, a metaphor too good to give up. But geology doesn't owe us metaphors. Diamonds didn't begin as coal. They began deeper, older, and entirely on their own, without needing to have once been something less. A duck's quack doesn't echo a pond at dusk, ducks chattering at the surface, and somewhere in the back of the trivia bin, a strange line that their quack, alone among sounds, simply doesn't bounce back from anything, as if the universe makes one quiet exception for waterfowl. A researcher at the University of Salford in England actually tested this set a duck named Daisy inside an anechoic chamber, then a reverberation chamber, and recorded her quacking in both. The echo was there. It just sounded strange. A quack is a long, fading sound that trails off gradually instead of cutting sharp, and the echo blends into the tail of the original call so smoothly that the human ear has trouble telling where one ends and the other begins. So the echo doesn't fail to happen. It just hides inside the sound that made it the quack and its own reflection, arriving so close together they sound like one continuous note. Physics doesn't make exceptions for any species. The duck is bound by the same rules as everything else. It just happens to make a noise that disguises what comes back. You need to drink 8 glasses of water a day. A water bottle on a desk marked with hourly goals, and somewhere underneath the habit, the old commandment, 8 glasses, every day, no exceptions, or something inside you starts running dry. The number has no real origin in medical research. It's often traced back to a 1945 recommendation that suggested roughly 2.5 liters of water a day, which sounds like the 8-glass rule, until you read the very next sentence, which noted that most of that water already comes from the food you eat. Fruit, vegetables, soup, coffee, tea, even bread carries water. The recommendation was never asking you to drink all of it on top of meals. It was describing your total intake, food included. Your body is also remarkably good at telling you when it needs water. Thirst is the signal, and it works. For most healthy people, drinking when thirsty and eating normal meals covers what the body actually needs. No counting required. The bottle isn't wrong to have nearby. It just isn't a quota you'll fail. Hydration was never a math test. Eating turkey makes you drowsy because of tryptophan. Thanksgiving table, plates emptied, and the uncle slumped sideways in his chair, while someone nods towards the carved bird. That's the tryptophan, they say, like it explains everything. Tryptophan is real, and it's an ingredient in how the body makes serotonin and melatonin, both linked to sleep. But turkey doesn't contain unusually high amounts of it. Chicken, pork, cheese, and eggs carry similar or higher levels, and nobody blames a grilled cheese for a nap. For tryptophan to actually nudge you toward sleep, it has to cross into the brain past a crowd of other amino acids competing for the same route, and a protein-heavy meal like turkey gives it some of the worst odds of any food. What's actually flattening everyone into the couch is the meal itself. Thousands of calories, heavy on carbs and fat, all consumed in under an hour, in a warm room, after wine, after a long morning. Digestion takes work. So does small talk with extended family. The turkey isn't drugging anyone. It's just the most visible thing on a table doing the real damage. Hair and nails keep growing after death. A body laid still, and the eerie rumor passed between people who've never actually seen one that hair keeps creeping out of the scalp, that fingernails inch forward in the dark of a coffin, growth continuing long after everything else has stopped. Nothing about this is biologically possible. Hair and nails grow through cell division, which requires oxygen, glucose, and a working bloodstream, 3 things that stop the moment a heart does. Without them, no new cell is built, no millimeter is added, anywhere on the body. What does happen is dehydration. The skin loses moisture and pulls back, shrinking slightly away from the base of the nails and the roots of the hair. What was already there now sits exposed by a few extra fractions of an inch, and to an observer who didn't measure before, it reads as growth. A nail that hasn't moved at all suddenly looks longer because the finger around it has receded. The body isn't doing anything new after death. It's just letting go, and the things that don't decay quickly stay behind, looking briefly, like they're still arriving. Different parts of your tongue's taste buds work independently. Each tiny bump visible on the tongue isn't a taste bud. It's a structure called a papilla, and inside each one sits a cluster of actual taste buds, sometimes dozens of them, packed in like seeds in a fig. The intuition is that each taste bud must specialize, one for sweet, one for sour, one for bitter, each operating on its own narrow assignment, the way separate workers might each handle one ingredient. The reality is messier and more elegant. A single taste bud contains around 50 to 100 sensory cells, and those cells together can respond to all 5 basic tastes. They aren't strict specialists, locked into one flavor. They're more like a small committee, with different members reacting more strongly to different stimuli, sending signals up to the brain that get assembled into a single impression of what you just ate. Taste, in other words, doesn't get sorted at the surface of the tongue. It gets sorted in the brain, after a flood of mixed signals arrives from buds that were never working in isolation. What feels like a clean signal, "this is sweet," is actually a translation, done somewhere upstream of the mouth entirely. Napoleon was unusually short. A small figure in a tall hat, one hand tucked into a waistcoat, cast forever in cartoons as the comically short tyrant, the man whose ambition supposedly had to make up for his height. Napoleon was listed at 5 feet 2 inches at his death in French units. Converted to the English measurement system, that's closer to 5 feet 6 or 7 inches. Average for a Frenchman of his era, possibly slightly above. The confusion between French inches and English inches alone shaved several inches off his reputation, and the mistake stuck. The myth also got help from his political enemies. British cartoonists during the Napoleonic Wars relentlessly drew him as a tiny, tantrum-throwing figure. Propaganda dressed as comedy, and the image traveled further than the measurements ever did. It also didn't help that he was often photographed surrounded by his personal guard, the Imperial Guard, who were specifically selected to be unusually tall. Standing next to them, anyone would look small. So the short tyrant of legend was a man of ordinary height, made small by a translation error and a cartoonist's pen. The complex named after him kept the joke alive long after the man himself was gone. Humans evolved from chimpanzees. A diagram passed around in school. A hunched chimp on the left, a few stooped figures in the middle, an upright human on the right, and the implied story marching across the page. That one became the next, in a straight line, with us at the end. That isn't how evolution works, and it isn't what the science actually says. Humans didn't descend from modern chimpanzees. We share a common ancestor with them, a species that lived somewhere around 6 to 7 million years ago, and was neither a chimp nor a human. From that ancestor, 2 lineages branched outward. One eventually became us, the other eventually became today's chimps and bonobos. It's less a ladder and more a fork in a road, taken a long time ago, with both paths still walking. The chimpanzees alive today have had just as much time to evolve as we have. They're not earlier drafts of us. They're cousins, not ancestors. The ladder picture survived because it tells a tidy story with a flattering ending. The actual tree is messier, older, and doesn't end at anyone in particular. Einstein failed math in school. A comforting story passed around to struggling students that even Einstein, the man whose name became a synonym for genius, once flunked his math classes. Proof that the slow start doesn't decide the finish. Einstein himself denied it in his lifetime. When asked directly about the rumor, he reportedly said he had mastered differential and integral calculus before he was 15. His school records back him up. By any measure available, he excelled at mathematics from a young age, winning praise from his teachers, working through advanced material early, and consistently scoring at the top of his class in math and physics. The myth seems to have started from a misreading of the Swiss grading system. His school used a scale where 6 was the highest mark, but earlier in his education a different system had been used where 1 was the highest, and someone, somewhere, looked at his 6s and assumed they were failures. The translation never quite caught up to the story. The comfort the rumor offered wasn't entirely wrong. Late bloomers exist, and slow starts happen. They just didn't happen to Einstein. You can see the Great Wall with the naked eye from the moon. The moon sits roughly 240,000 miles from Earth. Look at that distance, and the geometry alone settles the question at that range. The entire planet shrinks to a marble. Whole continents lose their outlines. The Great Wall, at its widest, is about 30 feet across. The human eye can only resolve objects that take up a certain angle in our field of view below that threshold. An object isn't small to us. It simply isn't there. From lunar distance, a 30-foot wide wall falls thousands of times below what an unaided eye can pick out. It would be like trying to spot a single strand of hair from across a football stadium, except the hair is also the same color as the field. The Apollo astronauts who actually stood on the moon were asked about this. They confirmed what the math already promised. You can make out the continents, the swirl of clouds, the blue of oceans. Individual structures of any kind simply don't show up. Whatever the Great Wall is, it isn't a thing the moon has ever seen. Chameleons change color to match their surroundings. A chameleon sat down on a checkerboard, and the long-running fantasy that it will start strobing through black and white squares like a confused photocopier, trying to vanish into the pattern. What chameleons actually use color for isn't camouflage in any direct sense. Their color shifts are mostly tied to mood, temperature regulation, and communication, particularly between males during territorial standoffs, or between males and females during courtship. A chameleon turning bright yellow and orange isn't disappearing into anything. It's making a statement, sometimes a threat, sometimes an invitation. The mechanism behind the shift is strange and beautiful. Special cells under their skin contain crystals that rearrange themselves at the chameleon's command, changing how light reflects off the surface. By spacing the crystals differently, the lizard literally tunes which wavelengths bounce back. Their natural resting colors do happen to blend well with their typical environment of leaves and branches, but that's evolution doing background work, not real-time camouflage. The chameleon is many things, but it isn't trying to match your wallpaper. It's mostly trying to be seen, and only by the right audience. Ostriches bury their heads in the sand when scared. The image is a cartoon staple, a giant flightless bird with its head jammed under the dirt, body sticking up like a feathered exclamation point, hoping whatever scared it will politely leave. Ostriches don't do this, and they never have. What they actually do, when a threat is too close to flee, is lie flat on the ground and stretch their long necks out along the dirt. From a distance, the small head and the sandy brown plumage blend into the terrain so well that the bird appears to vanish from the shoulders up, which, to an observer far away, can look exactly like a buried head. It's camouflage, not denial. Their actual first instinct, given any room to use it, is to run. Ostriches can sprint over 40 miles an hour, faster than almost any predator they'd ever face, and they'd much rather use those legs than play dead in plain sight. So the bird in the cartoon was misread for centuries, a creature lying low and hidden, mistaken for one too foolish to face the world. It was watching the whole time. Right-brain people are creative, left-brain people are logical. Right-brain people are creative, left-brain people are logical. An online quiz, 20 questions long, declares you a right-brained dreamer or a left-brained analyst, sorted neatly into one of two clean halves, like the skull came pre-divided at birth. The brain is split into two hemispheres, and they do specialize in some ways. Language processing leans more heavily on the left side in most people. Certain spatial tasks lean towards the right. But leans is the operative word. Brain imaging studies have repeatedly shown that almost every meaningful task, creative or logical, intuitive or analytical, pulls from both hemispheres at once, connected constantly by a thick bundle of fibers called the corpus callosum that keeps the two sides in non-stop conversation. A painter solving a composition problem isn't running on one hemisphere while their other half naps. A mathematician proving a theorem isn't either. Both are using nearly all of the brain, in patterns that don't sort cleanly into a personality test result. The myth survives because it offers a tidy identity, a permission slip to claim you were born for one kind of thinking and excused from the other. The actual brain doesn't issue those permission slips. It just keeps working, both sides, on whatever you put in front of it. The full moon causes erratic human behavior. Hospital nurses passing the phrase around on a busy shift, "Must be a full moon tonight," like the sky overhead has tipped some hidden lever in everyone walking through the doors. Researchers have actually checked. Multiple large-scale studies have combed through hospital records, police logs, psychiatric admissions, and emergency room data, comparing what happens on full moon nights to what happens on every other night. The pattern that emerges is almost boringly consistent. No statistically significant spike. Crime doesn't climb. Birth rates don't surge. Psychiatric episodes don't multiply. The moon goes round, and the data stays flat. What's likely happening is a trick of attention. On a full moon night, when something strange happens, the moon gets the credit, and the memory sticks. On every other night, the same strange things happen, and the moon isn't around to blame, so the moment slides by uncatalogued. Over years, the brain assembles a pattern that was never really there. The word lunatic even traces its roots back to this old belief. The etymology survived. The effect, when actually measured, never did. Searing meat seals in the juices. A steak hits a screaming hot pan, crust forms in seconds, and a chef nods knowingly that's the searing, sealing the juices inside, keeping the meat from drying out the way an envelope keeps a letter from spilling. The idea has a 19th century origin, traceable to a German chemist named Justus von Liebig, who proposed that a quickly seared crust formed a barrier against moisture loss. It sounded reasonable. Cooks adopted it. It traveled through cookbooks for over a century. When the experiment was finally run by weighing seared and unseared cuts before and after, cooking the seared piece consistently lost the same amount of moisture, or sometimes slightly more, than the unseared one. The crust isn't waterproof. Liquid passes through it during cooking just as readily as through any other surface of the meat. What searing actually does is more interesting than what the myth promised. The high heat triggers the Maillard reaction, a cascade of chemical changes between amino acids and sugars that produces hundreds of new flavor compounds and that deep brown crust. So the sear isn't sealing anything. It's building flavor that wasn't there before. Going outside with wet hair makes you sick. A mother at the front door, blocking the exit with a towel. Go back, dry your hair. You'll catch your death out there in this weather. Colds and flus are caused by viruses, not by temperature or moisture. You can stand in freezing rain with hair dripping for an hour, and if no virus is present, not catch a single thing. The cold itself, however unpleasant, has no mechanism for generating an infection out of nothing. What may be true, weakly, is that prolonged exposure to cold could put mild stress on the body's immune defenses, particularly in the upper airways, possibly making infection slightly easier if a virus is already nearby. But the virus has to come from somewhere. That somewhere is usually another person, indoors, where everyone gathers more in winter than in summer. That's the real reason cold seasons match cold weather. Not the weather itself, but the way it pushes humans into the same rooms together. The wet hair was never the threat. The threat was always the other people in the room you walked into afterward. Microwaves cause cancer. A box on the counter, humming for 90 seconds, and the half-rumor that whatever's coming out of it now carries something faintly poisoned radiation, lingering, working its way into the leftovers. Microwaves use a specific kind of radiation, but the word radiation covers an enormous range. Visible light is radiation. Radio waves are radiation. The heat coming off your skin is radiation. The dangerous kind, the kind that causes cancer, is called ionizing radiation, which carries enough energy per particle to knock electrons off atoms and damage DNA. Microwave radiation isn't powerful enough to do that. Not even close. It works by jostling water molecules in your food until friction heats them up. That's it. It also doesn't linger. The moment the microwave shuts off, the radiation stops exactly the way a room goes dark the moment a lamp is switched off. Nothing is being absorbed by the food and held there, waiting to harm you. The myth probably persists because the word radiation sounds older and more sinister than what's actually inside the box. The technology isn't dangerous. It's just badly named. Frankenstein is the name of the monster. Halloween night. A tall green figure with bolts in his neck, stomping up a porch, and someone says, "Here comes Frankenstein," without thinking twice about it. Frankenstein is the name of the scientist, the man who built the creature, not the creature itself. Victor Frankenstein, the obsessive young chemist at the center of Mary Shelley's 1818 novel, who stitches a being together from corpses, brings it to life, and then, horrified by what he's made, abandons it. The creature, in the book, has no name at all. Shelley refers to it as the creature, the demon, the wretch, the being. The lack of a name is part of the tragedy. The creature is articulate, lonely, and painfully aware that his maker won't even give him the dignity of a word to be called by. Decades of film adaptations collapsed the distinction. The monster wore the scientist's name on theater posters because Frankenstein sounded more haunting than the unnamed creature he made, and audiences stopped distinguishing. So the green figure on the porch is technically nameless. The man who made him has the name. And in the original story, that confusion is the cruelty. Glass is a slow-moving liquid. A tour guide at an old cathedral points to a stained glass window, thicker at the bottom than the top, and offers the elegant explanation. Glass is actually a slow liquid, sagging downward over centuries, gathering at its own base. The thickness is real. The reason isn't. Glass is what physicists call an amorphous solid. Its molecules are arranged in a disordered, non-crystalline pattern, more like a frozen snapshot of a liquid than like a regular crystal. But frozen is the operative word. At room temperature, the molecules don't flow. Calculations of how slowly glass would have to move suggest it would take longer than the current age of the universe for medieval window glass to sag any measurable amount under gravity. The actual reason old windows are thicker at the bottom is much simpler. Medieval glassmakers couldn't produce perfectly uniform sheets. Each pane came out uneven thicker on one side than the other, and when glaziers installed them, they sensibly placed the heavier edge at the bottom for stability. So every old window was built thicker at the base, on purpose, from day one. The glass hasn't moved an inch. The myth just gave it credit for human carpentry. Penguins mate for life. A pair of penguins waddling side by side across the ice, captioned on every nature documentary as a love story for the ages. A bond that lasts a lifetime, faithful and unbreakable, sealed by something purer than human marriage. Some penguin species do tend to pair with the same partner. Across multiple breeding seasons, Adelie penguins, for example, return to the same nesting sites and often reunite with last year's mate, but often isn't always. Studies tracking individual birds have found significant rates of divorce, pairs splitting and finding new mates the next season, sometimes after a failed clutch, sometimes for no observable reason at all. Some species show fidelity rates as low as 15% across years. Other species are openly polygamous. What looks like devotion is more often something simpler, a logistical alliance. Raising a chick in conditions that brutal requires two parents working in shifts, and pairing with a known, competent partner is a survival strategy first, a romance second, and quite possibly never a romance at all. The penguins weren't reading the script the documentary handed them. They were just trying to keep their eggs warm, with the most reliable colleague available. You can't fold a piece of paper in half more than 7 times. A small square of paper, folded once, twice, 6 times. And then, somewhere around the 7th attempt, the stack refuses to bend any further, and the old saying surfaces: 7 is the absolute limit, no matter the paper. For an ordinary sheet of standard letter-size paper, 7 is roughly where most people give up, not because of a law of physics, but because the math works against you faster than intuition expects. Each fold doubles the thickness and halves the surface area. After 7 folds, an ordinary sheet is over 100 layers thick, and its remaining area is too small for the stack to bend through. The limit isn't fundamental. It's about ratio, the relationship between how long the paper is and how thick it's become. In 2002, a high school student named Brittany Gallivan worked out the actual mathematics behind it and used a very long roll of toilet paper, over 1 kilometer in length, to fold a sheet in half 12 times. Later attempts pushed past that, with longer paper and more space. 7 isn't a wall, it's just where the average kitchen table runs out of room. Bananas grow on trees, a banana plantation, rows of tall green stalks dripping with hanging fruit, and the natural assumption that what's holding all of that up must be a tree-thick trunk, leaves, branches heavy with bananas. Botanically, none of that is a tree. A banana plant is technically a giant herb, and what looks like a trunk isn't wood at all. It's a tightly packed column of overlapping leaf bases called a pseudostem, soft, fibrous, and full of water. Cut into it, and you don't find growth rings or hardwood. You find layers, like an onion stretched tall. The whole structure is also short-lived. After producing one cluster of bananas, the entire pseudostem dies back, and a new shoot grows from the underground rhizome to replace it, a cycle closer to how a banana relates to grass than to how an apple relates to its tree. So the banana doesn't dangle from anything woody. It hangs from a tall, leafy plant that's biologically closer to a stalk of ginger than to an oak. The fruit aisle just doesn't have time to explain. The color of an eggshell affects its nutritional value. 2 cartons in a grocery aisle, side by side, one full of brown eggs labeled premium and priced higher, one full of white eggs sitting in the cheaper row, and the quiet implication that the brown ones must somehow be better for you. Eggshell color is determined by the breed of the hen, and nothing else. Hens with white feathers and white earlobes tend to lay white eggs. Hens with reddish-brown feathers and red earlobes tend to lay brown ones. The pigment that gives a brown shell its color is deposited in the final hours of egg formation, and it sits on the surface. It has no contact with the yolk or the white inside. Nutritionally, the two are essentially identical. Same protein, same fat, same vitamins, in nearly the same proportions. What actually changes the nutritional profile of an egg is what the hen ate and how she lived. Pasture-raised birds, eating insects and greens, produce eggs with slightly different fatty acid and vitamin levels than caged hens on commercial feed. But that has nothing to do with the color of the shell on the way out. The price gap is mostly cosmetic. Brown eggs come from larger breeds that eat more feed, and the cost gets passed along. The eggs themselves are the same egg. Spicy food causes ulcers, a burning bite of chili, a hand reaching for milk, and the warning from somewhere in the family, keep eating like that, and you'll burn a hole in your stomach. For most of the 20th century, doctors believed stomach ulcers were caused by stress and spicy or acidic foods irritating the stomach lining. Patients were put on bland diets, told to avoid coffee and chili and anything sharp, and given antacids to manage what was assumed to be a chronic, lifestyle-driven condition. Then, in the 1980s, 2 Australian researchers, Barry Marshall and Robin Warren, proposed something heretical. Most ulcers, they argued, were caused by a bacterium called Helicobacter pylori living in the stomach lining. The medical establishment dismissed them. Marshall famously drank a culture of the bacteria himself to prove the point, developed an ulcer, and treated it with antibiotics. The 2 later won a Nobel Prize for the discovery. Today, the vast majority of stomach ulcers are known to be caused either by H. pylori infection or by long-term use of certain anti-inflammatory drugs. Spicy food can irritate an existing ulcer, but it doesn't cause one to form. The chili was framed. The real culprit was microscopic. Static electricity from your body could ignite a gas station, a gas pump, a finger reaching for a touch screen mid-fueling, and the persistent rumor that the wrong static charge at the wrong moment could send the whole station up in flames. Static electricity at a gas pump is real, and it can, in rare cases, ignite gasoline vapors, but the danger isn't where the myth tends to put it. Most documented cases trace back to one specific behavior: a driver re-entering their car during fueling, sliding across the seat, building up a static charge, and then touching the nozzle when they get back out. That spark, jumping to a metal nozzle in the presence of fuel vapor, is what causes the rare fire, not the use of a phone. There is no documented case anywhere of a cell phone igniting a gas station fire. The energy a phone emits is too low, the spark too contained, the conditions too specific. Major safety organizations have repeatedly investigated and consistently found no link. The warnings on the pumps stayed up anyway. They cost nothing to leave there, and the rumor traveled faster than the data ever did. The real advice is much smaller. Don't get back in your car mid-fueling, and discharge yourself by touching metal before you grab the nozzle. The phone was never the threat. Houseflies live for only 24 hours. A housefly tapping itself against a kitchen window, and the small consolation passed around to anyone trying to swat it. Don't worry, it'll be dead by tomorrow anyway. they only live a day. Houseflies live considerably longer than a day. Under typical conditions, moderate temperatures, available food and water, an adult housefly lives somewhere between 2 and 4 weeks. Some live longer. Their full life cycle, from egg to fly, takes about 2 weeks on its own, and the adult flying stage is the longest portion of it. The mayfly is likely the source of the confusion. Adult mayflies, depending on species, live anywhere from a few minutes to a few days after they emerge from the water. Their entire purpose at that stage is to mate, lay eggs, and die. Somewhere along the way, the mayfly's tragic timeline got transferred to the housefly, possibly because both are small, winged, and annoying enough that humans don't pay close attention to which is which. So the fly bouncing against the window isn't on a one-day clock. It may have been alive longer than the half-eaten leftovers in the fridge it's been circling. Albert Einstein only used 10% of his brain. The myth is sometimes upgraded with a famous endorsement. Einstein himself, the story goes, once said that even he only used 10% of his brain, and if the greatest mind of the 20th century only managed that fraction, imagine what the rest of us are wasting. Einstein never said it. No letter, no interview, no published paper of his contains the line or anything close to it. The quote has been chased down by science writers and historians for decades, and the trail always ends the same way at no original source. Somewhere in the mid-20th century, the 10% claim got coupled to his name in a self-help book or a magazine article, and the pairing stuck because his name carried weight. Attach any claim to Einstein, and it sounds smarter immediately. It's a common trick in the long life of misinformation. Quotes drift toward famous mouths over time. Mark Twain gets credit for sayings he never wrote. Lincoln gets credit for things invented decades after his death. Einstein, being shorthand for genius, attracts more than his share. So the line about the brain is real in the sense that millions of people have repeated it. It just never came from him. The endorsement was forged in the retelling. Black holes are perfect holes that suck everything nearby in. The name itself is doing most of the damage. Hole, as if there's an opening in space, a drain in the cosmic sink, pulling anything that drifts near it down through the gap. A black hole isn't a hole. It's an object, an extraordinarily dense one, where so much mass has been compressed into so small a space that the gravity around it becomes inescapable past a certain distance. That distance is called the event horizon, and it isn't an edge. It's a boundary. Cross it, and no signal, not even light, can climb back out. But outside that boundary, a black hole's gravity behaves the same way any other mass's gravity behaves. If the sun were replaced this instant by a black hole of identical mass, the Earth wouldn't get pulled in. It would keep orbiting on exactly the same path it does now. The planets only fall in if they're already on a course to cross that inner boundary, and most things in the galaxy aren't. So the universe isn't dotted with vacuum drains. It's dotted with dense, quiet objects that mind their own gravity, like any other star, only more so. We have only 5 senses. A childhood lesson, repeated for a century sight: hearing, taste, touch, smell. 5 clean categories, 1 for each finger on a hand, easy enough to memorize by age 6. The real number is harder to pin down, and depending on how you define a sense, it's somewhere closer to a dozen or more. There's proprioception, the sense that tells you where your limbs are in space without looking, so you can touch your nose with your eyes closed. There's equilibrioception, the sense of balance, run by the inner ear, that keeps you upright. There's thermoception, the perception of temperature, which is separate from touch. There's nociception, the perception of pain, which is also separate from ordinary touch. There's an internal sense of hunger, of thirst, of needing to breathe, of needing to use the bathroom, all of them senses in any technical definition, because they're nerve signals reporting back about something. The five-sense model was inherited from Aristotle, who proposed it over 2,000 years ago. It survived because it's neat, not because it's right. So whatever else is happening in your body right now, there's more reporting in than the old list ever admitted to. Camels store water in their humps, a camel crossing a desert, hump rising from its back, and the comforting picture that the lump up there must be full of water. A private canteen built into the body, sipped from over days of travel. The hump contains fat, almost entirely fat. It's an energy reserve, not a water tank. When food becomes scarce, the camel can metabolize that fat for fuel, which is why the humps of underfed camels visibly shrink and lean to one side, slowly emptying out as the animal lives off its own stored reserves. What lets a camel survive without water for so long isn't the hump at all. It's an extraordinary set of adaptations spread across the rest of the body. Camels can tolerate body temperature swings that would kill most mammals, allowing them to conserve sweat. Their red blood cells are oval rather than round, which lets them keep flowing even when the blood thickens from dehydration. They can drink enormous volumes of water in a single sitting, up to 30 gallons in minutes, and store it throughout the body, not in any one tucked-away pocket. So the hump is real. The water is real. They just never met. Carrots significantly improve your night vision. A parent setting a plate of carrots on the table, promising that finishing them will let a kid see in the dark, sharp as a cat, lights off, perfect vision through the bedroom blackness. Carrots do contain beta-carotene, which the body converts into vitamin A, which is genuinely necessary for healthy eyes, particularly for the function of the rod cells in the retina, which handle low-light vision. If you're deficient in vitamin A, your night vision will suffer, and eating foods that restore it will improve things back toward normal. But that's the ceiling. Normal. Eating more carrots than your body needs doesn't push your vision past human limits into the dark, piercing range a kid imagines. The body uses what it requires and discards or stores the rest. The myth got a serious boost from British wartime propaganda in the 1940s. The Royal Air Force's pilots were shooting down enemy planes at night with the help of newly developed radar systems, which the British military wanted to keep secret. So they spread a cover story that their pilots' success came from eating extraordinary amounts of carrots. The story stuck. The radar stayed hidden. The vegetable was a screen. The sight was always coming from somewhere else. A peacock's tail feathers are mostly for mating displays only, with no other purpose. A male peacock unfurling that absurd fan of iridescent eyes behind him, and the biology textbook explanation, it's all for mating. Every shimmering inch of it, evolution's most flamboyant pickup line. The mating display is real, and it is the primary driver of how the tail evolved. But calling it the only purpose undersells what those feathers are actually doing. Researchers studying peacocks have found that the same elaborate tail also plays roles in territorial signaling between rival males, in startling predators when suddenly fanned, and in producing low-frequency vibrations through the feathers, sounds humans can barely hear, but other peacocks pick up clearly during displays. The feathers are essentially broadcasting on multiple channels at once: visual, acoustic, social. There's also the question of what the tail costs. It makes the bird heavier, slower, easier to spot. That cost is the point in evolutionary terms. Only a male healthy enough to survive while carrying that handicap proves he's worth mating with. The feathers are a fitness signal that works precisely because they're impractical. So the tail isn't just a billboard for females, it's an entire communication system, evolved to do several jobs at once, with the mating advertisement merely the loudest signal on a busy frequency. Mount Everest is the closest point on Earth to space. At 29,032 feet, Everest is the highest mountain measured from sea level, the tallest thing you can climb on the planet's surface. So the assumption follows easily. Standing on its summit, you must be standing closer to the edge of space than any other person on Earth. That assumption depends on something the Earth doesn't quite do. The planet isn't a perfect sphere. It bulges outward at the equator and flattens slightly at the poles, a shape called an oblate spheroid, caused by the Earth's spin pushing mass outward at the middle over billions of years. The equator sits about 13 miles farther from the planet's center than the poles do. Everest is in the Himalayas, far north of the equator. Chimborazo, a volcano in Ecuador, sits almost directly on the equatorial bulge. Even though Chimborazo is much shorter measured from sea level at about 20,500 feet, its summit ends up roughly 7,000 feet farther from the center of the Earth than Everest's does, which means the closest point on solid ground to outer space isn't in Nepal, it's in Ecuador. The mountain everyone names was the answer to a different question. The tallest one, not the highest one. The Sahara has always been a desert. The image is fixed in the mind, endless dunes, a sun that punishes everything beneath it, a place that has always been exactly the dry, lifeless expanse it is now, as if some landscapes are simply born hostile and stay that way forever. The Sahara, around 10,000 years ago, was green. Lakes covered large portions of it. Rivers cut across what is now empty sand. Grasslands stretched in every direction, populated by hippos, crocodiles, elephants, giraffes, and the early human communities that hunted and fished among them. Archaeologists have found rock paintings in the middle of the modern Sahara, depicting swimmers, cattle, lush vegetation scenes that would be unimaginable in the current desert, painted by people who lived where the dunes are now. What changed wasn't the land. It was the climate. A slow shift in Earth's orbit altered the monsoon patterns that watered the region, and over a few thousand years, the green Sahara dried out, retreated, and became the desert visible today. So the sand isn't the original landscape, it's just the most recent one. Underneath the dunes lies the floor of a much older, much wetter world that no one alive remembers. Sushi means raw fish, a sushi restaurant menu, the word repeated across every dish, and the natural English speaker conclusions, sushi must mean raw fish, the same way taco means a shell with stuff in it. The Japanese word sushi refers to the vinegared rice. That's the defining ingredient to short-grain rice, seasoned with rice vinegar, sugar, and salt. Whatever sits on top of, around, or alongside that rice can vary enormously. It can be raw fish. It can also be cooked fish, shrimp, egg, vegetables, tofu, fermented soybeans, or nothing but the rice itself wrapped in seaweed. The dish that most people picture when they hear the word slices of raw fish on a small pad of rice is called nigiri. Raw fish on its own, served without rice, is called sashimi, and isn't technically sushi at all by the original definition. Without the seasoned rice, the dish doesn't qualify. The confusion is understandable. Most Western sushi menus highlight the fish heavily, and the rice gets treated as a delivery vehicle. In Japan, the relationship is closer to reversed. The rice is the discipline, the fish is the topping. Velociraptors were the size shown in Jurassic Park. The dinosaur in the film is iconic, roughly 6 feet tall, lean, smart, hunting in pairs, slashing through kitchens and dragging human-sized prey into corners. Velociraptor became a household name almost overnight. The actual Velociraptor, the one paleontologists named, was about the size of a large turkey. 3 feet long, mostly tail, weighing perhaps 30 pounds. It also had feathers, actual feathers, the kind a bird wears, evidence of which has been recovered from fossilized arm bones with quill knobs still visible. A real velociraptor, if it walked into a kitchen, would look closer to a strange-looking pheasant than to a predator capable of stalking adult humans. The dinosaurs in the film were modeled more closely on a different animal, Deinonychus, a much larger relative that lived in North America and grew to roughly the size shown on screen. The author of the original novel actually knew this and used the name Velociraptor anyway because he found it more dramatic. So the terror that defined a generation of dinosaur fans was real. It just had a different name and a slightly more humble cousin wearing its branding. Humans have a lizard brain that controls primal instincts. Self-help books love this one. There's a primitive lizard brain deep inside your skull. The story goes a reptilian remnant from millions of years ago, responsible for your fear, aggression, hunger, and impulse, while the more evolved parts of your brain wrap around it like newer software running on ancient hardware. The idea comes from a 1960s model called the triune brain, proposed by neuroscientist Paul MacLean. He suggested the human brain could be divided into 3 layers, a reptilian core, a mammalian middle layer, and a higher human outer layer, each added over evolution, each handling progressively more sophisticated tasks. It's a clean story, and it's been thoroughly disproven. Modern neuroscience has found no such layered structure. The parts of the human brain that handle fear, aggression, and instinct aren't relics inherited unchanged from reptiles. They've evolved continuously alongside everything else, and they're deeply interconnected with the higher cognitive regions, not buried beneath them. Reptiles, meanwhile, have their own complex brain regions that don't map onto the primitive core the model imagined, so nothing primitive is lurking under your thoughts, waiting to take over. The brain you have is one brain modern, integrated, working as a whole, with no ancient lizard hiding in the basement. Toilets flush counterclockwise in the northern hemisphere and clockwise in the southern somewhere near the equator in Ecuador or Kenya. A tourist at this stands at a wooden hut where a guide has set up 3 basins, one on the north side of a painted line, one directly on it, one on the south side. The guide pours water into the northern basin. It swirls one way. He pours into the southern basin. It swirls the other way. The middle basin drains straight down, with no rotation at all. The audience claps. Money changes hands. The trick is in the wrist. Watch the demonstrator closely, and you can see what's actually happening. When filling the northern basin, they pour the water in a slight circular motion in one direction. When filling the southern basin, they pour the opposite way. The basins themselves are identical. The water swirls because the water was given that swirl on the way in, and the basin simply holds whatever rotation it received. The hemispheric line painted on the ground is also frequently off by a few hundred yards from the actual equator, because the actual equator isn't where the tourists park. What's being sold isn't physics. It's a magic trick dressed in a geography costume, and it works because the audience already arrived believing it. You only dream in black and white if you're older. A grandparent describes a dream in grayscale, and a younger relative shrugs. That's just an age thing, isn't it? Older brains dream in black and white. Color in dreams isn't an age phenomenon. It's a media phenomenon. Researchers studying dream content across generations found that people who grew up before the era of color television, particularly those whose formative years were spent watching black and white films and shows, were significantly more likely to report dreaming in black and white. People who grew up in the color TV era report color dreams almost universally. The brain seems to lean on the visual vocabulary it's been most exposed to. If most of the moving images you absorbed as a child came in grayscale, your dream imagery tends to draw from that palette. If you grew up watching color, color is what your dreams produce. So the grandparent in this scenario isn't dreaming differently because they're older. They're dreaming differently because of the screens they sat in front of when they were young. The dreams kept the format the world used to come in. The Big Bang was an explosion in space. The name is misleading on purpose. Bang suggests a detonation, a single point in space where matter erupted outward into the surrounding emptiness, the way a firework throws light into a dark sky. That picture has the geometry wrong in a fundamental way. There was no surrounding space. There was no outside for anything to expand into. Whatever happened roughly 13.8 billion years ago wasn't matter exploding through space. It was space itself expanding everywhere all at once. Every point in the early universe was getting farther from every other point, not because they were flying apart through a pre-existing emptiness, but because the distances between them were stretching. A common analogy is a balloon being inflated. Imagine dots drawn on the surface of the balloon. As the balloon grows, every dot moves away from every other dot, but no dot is the center, and the dots aren't moving across the rubber. The rubber itself is stretching beneath them. So the Big Bang didn't happen somewhere. It happened everywhere, including the spot you're currently sitting in. The expansion that started then is still happening now, in every direction at once, including the room you're listening from. Your blood is blue inside your body. Look at the back of your hand, and the veins beneath the skin appear unmistakably blue. The explanation seemed reasonable enough. Blood must be blue inside the body, and only turns red when it hits the air after a cut. Blood is red, always. Both kinds. Oxygen-rich blood, the kind freshly pumped from the lungs, flowing through arteries, is a bright cherry red. Oxygen-poor blood, the kind returning to the heart through veins after delivering its oxygen, is a darker, deeper red, closer to a maroon. Neither has ever been blue at any point in the body. The veins look blue because of how light interacts with skin. Red and yellow wavelengths get absorbed by tissue more readily than blue ones. The blue wavelengths bounce back more efficiently through the skin's layers, reach your eye, and the brain interprets the visible vein as blue, even though the actual blood inside it is the same dark red as everywhere else. So the blue you see on the back of your hand isn't blood at all. It's an optical artifact, a trick of how light moves through skin. Cut anywhere on the body, and the same dark red appears, no transition required. Sleepwalkers should never be woken up. A figure walks through the dark hallway, eyes open, but unfocused, hands brushing a wall, and the rule passed quietly between family members says, "Do not wake them. It could kill them. The shock could stop their heart." There is no documented case of a sleepwalker dying or suffering serious harm from being woken up. Waking a sleepwalker may startle them, disorient them, occasionally provoke a brief, panicked reaction. They may not immediately know where they are or who you are. That confusion fades within seconds. No medical literature supports the idea that the wake-up itself causes any lasting damage. What's actually risky about sleepwalking isn't the wake-up, it's the walking. Sleepwalkers can trip down stairs, walk into traffic, unlock doors, drive cars, even handle sharp objects, all while unconscious enough to have no memory of any of it the next morning. Leaving a sleepwalker to navigate that on their own carries far more risk than gently steering them back to bed. The advice most doctors actually give is the opposite of the old warning. If you can guide them back to bed without waking them, do that. It's the path of least disruption. But if you can't, wake them. Carefully, gently. The danger has always been the walking, not the waking. Caffeine stunts your growth. A teenager reaches for a cup of coffee at breakfast, and a parent intercepts. That'll stunt your growth, like the threat is a small printed warning on the side of every mug. The fear traces back to early 20th century studies that linked caffeine to bone density loss and osteoporosis. The connection turned out to be much weaker than first suspected, and the studies that suggested it failed to account for a critical variable. People who drank a lot of coffee tended to drink less milk and consume less calcium overall. It wasn't the caffeine harming their bones, it was the calcium they weren't getting because they replaced it with coffee. Follow-up studies that controlled for diet found no significant effect of normal caffeine consumption on bone growth, final adult height, or skeletal development. Children and teenagers who drink moderate amounts of caffeine grow to the height their genetics already had planned for them. What caffeine does affect, reliably, is sleep. And in growing kids, sleep is when growth hormone actually does its work. So the indirect concern isn't fully wrong. A teenager wired on caffeine at midnight is sleeping less, and consistent sleep loss can have its own consequences. But the coffee itself isn't shrinking anyone. The bedtime might be. Different cultures see fewer colors in the rainbow. A surprising claim makes the rounds occasionally that speakers of some languages can't actually see certain colors because their language doesn't have separate words for them. The Russians, the story goes, see more shades of blue than English speakers because Russian has two different basic words for light blue and dark blue, where English just has blue. The biology of color vision is identical across cultures. Every healthy human eye has the same 3 types of cone cells, responding to the same wavelengths of light. A speaker of any language is receiving the same color information at the retina as anyone else. What language does affect is something more subtle: categorization speed. Experiments have shown that Russian speakers can sort light blues from dark blues slightly faster than English speakers, because the brain has already drawn a categorical line there at the level of vocabulary. The Himba people of Namibia, whose language groups certain greens and blues differently, sort colors along their own boundaries quickly. It's not perception that changes, it's the speed of naming. So the rainbow looks the same to everyone. The words that get reached for next are just sorted into different drawers depending on which language opened them first. Vikings wore horned helmets. The image is fixed in every cartoon, every opera costume, every Halloween aisle, a Viking warrior with a pair of curved horns rising from his helmet, leaping off a longship with an axe in hand. No Viking ever wore one. Archaeologists have excavated hundreds of Viking-era helmets, and not a single confirmed one features horns. The helmets that have been recovered are simple, rounded iron caps, sometimes with a nose guard, sometimes with eye protection. Practical, close-fitting, designed for combat where anything sticking out would catch on enemy weapons and pull the wearer's head sideways at the worst possible moment. The horned helmet image traces back to 19th century costume designers, specifically Carl Emil Doppler, who designed the costumes for Richard Wagner's ring operas in the 1870s. He gave the Viking-inspired characters horned and winged helmets for dramatic stage effect, and the look was so striking it embedded itself permanently in popular culture. Within a generation, every illustrator drawing Vikings was reaching for horns. So the most famous Viking accessory was a German theatrical invention from over 800 years after the actual Viking Age ended. The real warriors fought in plain iron caps and would have laughed at anyone trying to fight in horns. Medieval people thought the earth was flat. The story is a familiar shorthand that everyone in the Middle Ages believed the earth was flat, that Christopher Columbus had to convince a doubting court he wouldn't sail off the edge, that humanity only realized the planet was round when explorers proved it. The Earth's roundness was known throughout the educated population of medieval Europe and had been since antiquity. Greek philosophers had not only established the planet was spherical, Eratosthenes had even calculated its circumference with remarkable accuracy by measuring the angle of shadows in 2 different cities. That knowledge passed into Roman education, then into medieval scholarship, where it remained the standard understanding among anyone with formal learning. Medieval kings and scholars depicted the earth as a globe in their art. Religious manuscripts show it that way. University textbooks discussed it as a given. The actual debate Columbus had with the Spanish court wasn't whether the earth was round. It was whether his estimate of its size was correct. He thought the earth was smaller than it actually is, which is why he assumed he could reach Asia by sailing west. His critics were right. He just got lucky and bumped into a continent that wasn't on his map. The flat earth in the Middle Ages story is largely a 19th century invention propaganda meant to flatter the modern era at the expense of the medieval one. Salem witches were burned at the stake. The phrase Salem witch trials conjures a specific image. A tied figure, a pile of wood, flames climbing as a crowd watches in colonial Massachusetts. No one was burned at Salem. Of the 20 people executed during the 1692 trials, 19 were hanged. One man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death under heavy stones over the course of 2 days after refusing to enter a plea, a brutal punishment, but not a burning. Several others died in prison while awaiting trial. None were set on fire. The burning at the stake image came from European witch hunts, which had taken place across the previous centuries in places like Germany, France, and Scotland. Continental European law often classified witchcraft as heresy, and heresy was punished by burning. English law, which the Salem colonists were operating under, classified witchcraft as a felony, and felony was punished by hanging. The image got transplanted across the Atlantic in popular memory, because Salem and witch trials sound European enough that the European method got assumed. Films and illustrations reinforced it for generations. The real Salem was grim enough without the embellishment: 20 deaths, dozens more imprisoned, an entire community tearing itself apart over accusations no court should have entertained. The fires belong to a different chapter. in a different country. Salem's horror was quieter and rope-shaped. Stress turns hair grey overnight. Marie Antoinette, the night before her execution, supposedly woke with her hair turned completely white from terror. Thomas More, the night before his. The story repeats across history: a great fright, a single sleepless night, hair gone grey by morning, as if the body could redecorate itself in hours. Hair color is determined by pigment-producing cells called melanocytes, which deposit pigment into each strand as it grows. Once a strand has left the follicle and grown out from the scalp, its color is fixed. It's no longer a living tissue capable of changing. It's essentially a long, dead fiber, the same color it was the day it was made. No amount of stress can change the color of hair that has already grown. What stress can do is more gradual. Research has linked chronic stress to accelerated graying over months and years by depleting the melanocyte stem cells that replenish the pigment-producing population. A stressful year can leave visibly more gray hairs at the roots than the year before. But that change happens at the follicle, with new growth not along the length of strands already present. The overnight transformation in those old stories was probably something else entirely. Some people, under sudden severe stress, develop a condition called alopecia areata, in which the immune system attacks pigmented hairs specifically and leaves the already grey hairs behind. The dark hair falls out. What's left looks, very suddenly, white. The hair didn't change color overnight. It just lost the parts that weren't grey already. Reading in dim light ruins your eyesight. A child curled under a blanket with a flashlight and a paperback, and a parent's warning floating in from the doorway. Keep reading in that dim a light, and you'll ruin your eyes. You'll need glasses by next year. Reading in low light makes your eyes work harder. The pupils dilate to let in more light. The muscles that focus the lens strain to maintain a sharp image. After a long stretch in dim conditions, the eyes feel tired, sometimes sore, a temporary fatigue called eye strain. Eye strain is uncomfortable. It isn't damage. The structural health of the eye, the cornea, the retina, the lens, the optic nerve, isn't affected by reading in poor lighting. A good night's sleep resolves the symptoms. The next morning, the eyes are exactly as they were before. No accumulating wear, no slow degradation, no permanent harm. Nearsightedness, which has risen dramatically in recent decades, does have environmental causes, but the most strongly supported one isn't dim reading. It's a lack of time spent outdoors during childhood. Natural daylight, particularly bright outdoor light, appears to play a role in how the developing eye shapes itself. Indoor reading, dim or bright, isn't the variable that matters most. So the child under the blanket isn't ruining anything. They're just slightly tired the next day, and slightly more in love with whatever they were reading. The tongue map of taste zones is scientifically accurate. The strangest part of the tongue map story isn't that it was wrong. It's how long it stayed in classrooms after being thoroughly disproven. By the 1970s, scientists had clearly demonstrated that all taste regions of the tongue can detect all basic tastes, with only minor variations in sensitivity. The original 1901 research had been mistranslated, the conclusions overstated, and the experimental evidence against the rigid zones model was overwhelming. The map should have died there. Instead, it kept appearing in middle school textbooks, in health curricula, on placemats at diner-style restaurants, in trivia books, in introductory biology classes well into the 2000s. The illustration was so visually satisfying, so easy to print and memorize, that publishers kept including it long after the science had moved on. Generations of students learned a model that researchers in the field had already abandoned. Part of why it persisted is the deeper truth of how textbooks get made. Once an image is locked into the canon of a subject, removing it requires someone to actively decide to remove it. Inertia tends to win. Errors that are simple and visual outlive errors that are complex and prose-based, because pictures travel from edition to edition more easily than the captions explaining them. So the tongue map is a small case study in something larger: how a wrong idea, drawn well enough, can outlive the science that disproved it by decades. Humans are the only animals that laugh. Laughter has long been treated as a uniquely human quality, proof that something in our species can find the world funny in a way nothing else can. Other animals fight, mate, hunt, sleep. Only humans, the story goes, laugh. Rats laugh. When tickled, they produce high-frequency vocalizations, too high for humans to hear without specialized equipment that researchers have identified as something genuinely close to laughter, repeated more enthusiastically when the rat is in a positive emotional state and absent when the rat is stressed. Some rats actively seek out being tickled and chase the researcher's hand for more. Chimpanzees and other great apes laugh during play, producing a panting, breathy vocalization that's been linked through evolutionary studies to the same root system as human laughter. Dogs produce a distinctive breathy sound during play that researchers consider their version of the same response. Dolphins, magpies, and several primate species all show vocalizations during play that meet the criteria for laughter under most definitions. What may be more uniquely human is the kind of laughter we produce: laughter at jokes, at irony, at things that are funny, without being physical play. The capacity for amusement at abstract incongruity may be ours alone. But the basic sound of joy made audible, the noise a body makes when something delights it, humans aren't the only ones making that noise. A coin dropped from a tall building could kill someone. A penny dropped from the top of the Empire State Building, the warning goes, picks up enough speed on the way down to punch a hole straight through a pedestrian's skull. Every action movie since the 1980s has taken the idea seriously enough to film it. A falling object can't accelerate forever. Air resistance pushes back against it more and more strongly as it speeds up, until the upward drag matches the downward pull of gravity. At that point, the object stops accelerating and falls at a constant speed, its terminal velocity. For an object as small and flat as a penny, terminal velocity is somewhere between 25 and 50 miles per hour, depending on how it's oriented as it falls. That's a meaningful speed, but it isn't a lethal one. A penny hitting someone at 30 miles per hour would sting, possibly raise a welt, possibly hurt enough to make the person flinch and curse. It wouldn't penetrate a skull. Pennies are also flat, light, and unstable. In flight, they tend to tumble and flutter rather than spear downward, which slows them further. The myth survives because the math feels intuitive in the wrong way. Tall building plus gravity plus enough time sounds like it should add up to something deadly. But the physics has a built-in speed limit, and a penny hits its ceiling long before it could threaten anyone walking below. Cold weather causes the common cold. The correlation is real, and that's part of what keeps the myth alive. People genuinely do get more colds in winter. Pediatricians' waiting rooms fill up. Tissue sales spike. The link between low temperatures and runny noses isn't imaginary. It's just been pointed at the wrong cause for centuries. Colds are caused by viruses, primarily rhinoviruses, which spread person to person through droplets and contact. What changes in winter isn't the air's ability to make you sick on its own. What changes is human behavior. When it's cold outside, people spend dramatically more time indoors, in heated buildings, breathing the same recirculated air as everyone else around them. Schools, offices, public transit, family gatherings, all become high-density transmission environments for whatever virus is circulating. There's also a small biological piece. Cold, dry winter air dries out the mucous membranes in the nose, which slightly weakens one of the body's first physical defenses against airborne viruses. Some research suggests rhinoviruses also replicate more efficiently at the slightly lower temperatures found in the nasal passages during cold weather. Neither of these effects creates a cold from nothing, but they may help an already encountered virus take hold a little more easily. So winter doesn't make you sick. Winter just rearranges where people stand and what they're breathing, and the viruses do the rest. You can starve to death from eating only rabbit meat. The idea sounds almost contradictory. Meat is meat, calories are calories. How could eating something abundant and protein-rich starve you? But early Arctic explorers and frontier trappers in North America noticed something strange when they were forced to live off rabbit alone for long stretches. They got weaker. They lost weight rapidly. Some developed nausea, diarrhea, and severe fatigue. Some died. The phenomenon became known as rabbit starvation or protein poisoning. Rabbit meat is extraordinarily lean, almost no fat, very little carbohydrate, and a great deal of protein. The human body needs protein, but it can only process so much of it at a time. The liver has a ceiling on how much nitrogen it can convert to urea for excretion, and when that limit is exceeded, the body becomes unable to safely metabolize more incoming protein. What's missing isn't calories, it's usable calories. The body needs fat or carbohydrate to provide the bulk of its energy. Without either, no amount of lean protein can fill the gap, and the body begins burning through its own fat reserves, then its own muscle tissue, while a person is technically eating constantly. So a person dying of rabbit starvation isn't dying from hunger in the usual sense. They're dying with a full stomach, surrounded by food, because the food they have can't keep them alive on its own. Survival in cold, remote conditions needed fat as much as it needed flesh. Eating fat makes you fat. The logic seems airtight in the most intuitive way. Eat fat, become fat. The names match. The substance you put in your mouth is the substance that appears on your body. Decades of food labels, low-fat products, and dietary guidelines were built on the assumption. The body doesn't work by direct substance transfer. When you eat fat, it's broken down into smaller components, fatty acids and glycerol, and used by the body for energy, hormone production, cell membrane construction, and the absorption of certain vitamins. Excess calories from any source, fat, carbohydrate, or protein, can be stored as body fat. But there's no special pipeline that routes dietary fat straight into adipose tissue while leaving other macronutrients innocent. The actual driver of weight gain is total caloric balance over time. If you consume more energy than you burn, the body stores the surplus. The form that surplus takes, whether it came from olive oil, bread, or chicken breast, doesn't determine where it ends up. A diet high in carbohydrates can produce just as much body fat as a diet high in dietary fat if total calories are similar. The low-fat era of the 1980s and 1990s, built on this myth, often replaced fat with sugar and refined starches in processed foods, and obesity rates kept rising. The substance on the label was never the variable that mattered most. The Inuit have 100 words for snow. The line gets repeated as a kind of folk wisdom that the Inuit, surrounded by snow in every direction, have developed a vocabulary impossibly rich in words for the substance, distinguishing dozens or hundreds of varieties that English bundles into a single word. The claim is mostly an artifact of how Inuit languages are structured, rather than a real reflection of an unusually large snow vocabulary. Inuit languages, particularly Inuktitut, and related languages of the Eskimo-Aleut family, are polysynthetic. Speakers can build a single long word out of a root plus a chain of suffixes, where English would use a whole phrase. The English sentence, "The falling snow that we walked through last winter," can be expressed as a single agglutinated word in Inuktitut. Count each variation as a separate word, and the number balloons quickly. Count by root words for snow, and the number drops to something modest, roughly comparable to English, which has snow, sleet, slush, powder, flurry, blizzard, and so on. The myth seems to have started with an anthropologist's offhand 1911 comment about 4 Inuit snow terms, which subsequent writers inflated over the decades, first to 7, then to 50, then to 100, then beyond. Each retelling embellished a little further, until the original modest observation had grown into linguistic folklore. The Inuit do, of course, have detailed vocabulary for the substance that fills their environment, but so do skiers, mountaineers, and anyone whose work depends on snow conditions. The vocabulary scales to the need, not to the legend. Left-handed people die younger. In the early 1990s, a pair of psychologists published a study claiming that left-handed people died, on average, 9 years earlier than right-handed people. The finding made headlines. It got cited for years. It seemed to confirm a vague suspicion that left-handedness, statistically rare, must come with some hidden cost. The study had a serious problem with how it was designed. The researchers had collected data on deceased people and asked their families whether the deceased had been left or right-handed. The issue wasn't with the dying, it was with the living context they came from. Until the mid-20th century, left-handed children in many Western countries were aggressively forced to switch to using their right hands. Teachers, parents, and religious figures pressured or punished left-handed children into right-hand use. As a result, older generations contained almost no remaining left-handers. Most had been converted decades earlier. Younger generations, raised after this pressure faded, contained far more openly left-handed people. So when researchers sampled across all ages of the deceased, they found that the left-handers in their data skewed young, not because left-handers were dying early, but because almost no one over the age of 70 in their sample identified as left-handed in the first place. When later studies controlled for this generational shift, the lifespan difference disappeared. Left-handed people live about as long as everyone else. The earlier finding was real in its numbers and entirely wrong about its cause. The data was right. The question it was answering wasn't the one anyone thought it was. Dogs see only in black and white. A dog stares at a red ball on green grass, fetches it without hesitation, and somewhere in the long inheritance of pet trivia sits the assumption that whatever the dog sees is a grayscale movie gray ball. Gray grass, gray everything. Dogs see in color, less color than humans, but color all the same. Human eyes have 3 types of cone cells, each tuned to a different range of wavelengths, roughly red, green, and blue, which the brain combines into the full visible spectrum. Dogs have only 2 types of cones, tuned closer to blue and yellow. Their vision is similar to what humans with red-green color blindness experience. Reds and greens appear muted, often shifted toward shades of yellow or brown. Blues and yellows look vivid and clear. So that red ball on the green lawn doesn't actually pop the way it does for the human throwing it. To the dog, it likely looks like a yellowish-brown object on a yellowish-brown background, which is why dogs often track moving objects better than stationary ones, and why blue toys are easier for them to find than red ones. The world hasn't been monochrome for any dog. It's just been painted from a smaller palette than the one humans were given. Owls can turn their heads all the way around. A cartoon owl swivels its head in a complete circle while watching something walk past. 360 degrees, smooth as a clock hand, eyes locked on its target the entire way. Owls can't actually turn their heads all the way around. Their maximum rotation is roughly 270 degrees in either direction, 3/4 of a full turn, which is genuinely extraordinary, but still short of the cartoon version. The reason they can rotate that far is a set of beautifully evolved adaptations the cartoon never bothered to explain. Owls have 14 vertebrae in their necks, double the number humans have. Their major arteries pass through specially enlarged channels in those vertebrae, with extra slack and reservoirs that prevent the blood supply to the brain from being cut off during extreme rotation. Their eyes are also fixed in place. They can't move within the socket the way human eyes can, so the head has to do all the work of redirecting their gaze. Without those adaptations, a similar rotation in a human would tear the arteries apart and cut off blood to the brain. Owls have engineered around the problem in a way evolution rarely bothers to solve so thoroughly. So the head doesn't quite spin all the way. It just turns far enough that no prey ever sees it coming from a direction the owl can't follow. Cats always land on their feet. A cat tumbles off a kitchen counter, twists in midair, lands silently on all 4 paws, and the old assurance follows they always land on their feet, every time, no matter the height. Cats do have a remarkable righting reflex, made possible by an unusually flexible spine and a sense of balance precise enough to detect the direction of down almost instantly. Given enough time in the air, a falling cat can rotate to bring its feet beneath it before impact. High-speed photography has captured the maneuver in detail. Head rotates first, then front legs, then the back half of the body follows, all in a fraction of a second. The maneuver has limits. From very low heights, a cat doesn't have enough time in the air to complete the rotation. It may land awkwardly, on its side or back. From extremely high falls, the cat can land feet first, but still suffer severe injury from the impact itself, regardless of how it landed. Strangely, falls from middle heights, high enough for the cat to right itself, low enough to slow into a stable position, sometimes produce less serious injury than expected, because cats relax and spread their limbs to increase drag, slowing their terminal velocity. Veterinarians sometimes call this high-rise syndrome, observing that cats falling from many stories survive more often than the falls would suggest. The landing isn't magic, it's biomechanics with a few exceptions, and a small ceiling. The bystander effect works exactly the way the Kitty Genovese case suggested. In 1964, a young woman named Kitty Genovese was murdered outside her apartment in Queens. The New York Times reported, in a story that traveled around the world, that 38 witnesses had watched the attack from their windows and done nothing. No one called the police. No one intervened. All 38 stood silently as a woman was killed below them. The story became the founding case study for what psychologists called the bystander effect, the idea that the more people present during an emergency, the less likely any one of them is to help, because each assumes someone else will. The original Times reporting got nearly every detail wrong. Later investigations found that the actual number of witnesses was far smaller than 38. Several neighbors did call the police. One ran outside and stayed with Genovese as she died. The attack happened in 2 stages, partly out of view from most apartments, and many of the people described as witnesses had heard sounds in the night, but had no clear understanding of what was happening, a common feature of city noise that doesn't announce itself as a crime. The psychological phenomenon called the bystander effect is real and has been confirmed in controlled experiments. People are, on average, less likely to help when surrounded by other potential helpers, but the founding story used to teach it was largely fiction, dramatized by a newspaper looking for a particular kind of horror to tell. The case taught a real lesson, but not the one it was reported as teaching. Humans have a finite, unchanging number of taste buds for life. The assumption is reasonable enough. Your taste buds are part of your body. Your body is mostly built and stable by adulthood, so the taste buds you have at 30 must be the ones you'll carry to 90, slowly worn down by decades of hot coffee and spicy food. Taste buds regenerate constantly. The sensory cells inside each taste bud have a lifespan of roughly 10 days. After that, they die and are replaced by new cells generated from stem cells in the surrounding tissue. The entire population of taste-sensing cells in your mouth turns over every week or 2. The taste buds you're using to taste anything right now are different cells from the ones you used at the same meal a month ago. What does change with age is the number and sensitivity of taste buds, slowly, over decades. Children typically have more taste buds than adults, which is partly why kids often find bitter foods overwhelming, and adults grow to tolerate or even enjoy them. By old age, the total number of functioning taste buds has decreased, and the remaining ones may be less responsive, which is why elderly people sometimes report that food has lost flavor. So the system isn't fixed. It's renewing itself constantly, just at a slow downward slope across a lifetime. Every meal is tasted with cells that didn't exist 2 weeks earlier. You can tell a storm is coming because your joints ache. A grandmother flexes her knee on the porch, frowns at the sky, and announces a storm is on the way. Before any cloud is visible, her joints have told her, and the joints, the family agrees, have a perfect record. There's a real physical mechanism at the root of this. As a storm approaches, atmospheric pressure drops. Lower air pressure means less force pressing inward on the tissues of the body, which can allow joints, especially ones with existing arthritis, old injuries, or inflammation, to swell very slightly. That swelling can press on nerves and produce real, measurable discomfort. Studies tracking patients with arthritis have found small but consistent correlations between barometric pressure drops and increased reports of joint pain. What the grandmother is feeling isn't imaginary. The leap that is questionable is the prediction. Pressure drops happen for many reasons that don't lead to storms. Weather systems shift constantly. Aching joints correlate with bad weather a bit more often than chance. but they're nowhere near reliable enough to function as a forecast. Far more storms come without warning, aches, and far more aches arrive without storms following. What survives in family lore is the memory of the hits. The misses get forgotten. The body did notice something real. The interpretation just gave it more credit than data ever earned. Newton discovered gravity when an apple fell on his head. A young Isaac Newton sits under a tree in his mother's garden. An apple drops onto his head. And in that instant, the story goes, the entire concept of gravity assembles itself in his mind. A complete theory delivered by fruit. Newton himself never claimed an apple hit him. He did, late in his life, tell a story about watching an apple fall from a tree in his mother's orchard during the plague year of 1666, when he was sheltering at home from the outbreak in London. Watching it fall, he later said, prompted him to wonder why the apple traveled straight down toward the center of the earth rather than sideways or upward, and to begin thinking about whether the same force pulling the apple was the same force keeping the moon in orbit. That was the beginning of a chain of thinking that took him over 20 years to fully work out into the mathematical framework published in his Principia in 1687. Gravity, as a scientific theory, was the product of decades of work in mathematics, physics, and astronomy, not a single eureka moment under a tree. The image of an apple striking his head was added by later storytellers, including Voltaire, who heard the story second-hand from Newton's niece and made it more dramatic in the retelling. The fruit became a falling object, then a falling object on a target, then a single instant of genius. The real discovery was much slower and a lot less theatrical. Marie Antoinette said, "Let them eat cake." The line is fixed in popular memory. The French queen, told that her starving subjects had no bread, supposedly responded with frivolous indifference, "Let them eat cake." The phrase became shorthand for aristocratic cluelessness, a single sentence summarizing why a revolution was coming. Marie Antoinette never said it. There's no record of her ever using the phrase in writing or in reported speech. The line, in its original French, "Qu'ils mangeons de la brioche," appears in print before she had even arrived in France. The philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, writing his Confessions around 1765, attributed the quote to a great princess whose name he didn't specify. At the time he wrote it, Marie Antoinette was about 9 years old and still living in Austria. The phrase got attached to her name decades later, during and after the French Revolution, when there was strong political motivation to portray the Queen as callous and out of touch. It worked. The line stuck. It traveled with her into history, into the trial that ended her life, and into every cultural reference to her since. By the available evidence, the real Marie Antoinette was wealthier and more isolated than her subjects, but no more dismissive of their hunger than the rest of the French royal household. The single line that defines her in popular memory wasn't hers. It just needed someone famous enough to belong to. Ancient Romans used vomitoriums to purge food during feasts. The image is luxuriously decadent. A Roman senator in a toga, gorged on roast pheasant and honeyed wine, retreating to a private chamber called a vomitorium to empty his stomach so he can return to the table and eat more. The word seems to confirm the practice. The word is also where the confusion started. A vomitorium in ancient Rome was an architectural term, not a culinary one. It referred to the passageways in amphitheaters and stadiums through which crowds entered and exited the seating area. The structures vomited forth the audience, in the Latin sense of spilling out rapidly. The Colosseum had vomitoria. Every major Roman public venue did. They were structural features designed to move thousands of people through narrow openings quickly. The misunderstanding seems to have grown in the 19th and 20th centuries, when writers familiar with the word vomitorium assumed it referred to a room specifically built for purging during banquets, a literalization of the Latin root that the Romans themselves never made. Some wealthy Romans almost certainly did induce vomiting during long feasts. The practice is mentioned in a few ancient sources. But they didn't have purpose-built rooms for it, and the word being used now wasn't the word they would have used. The vomitorium in the Colosseum was, in modern terms, an exit ramp. Nothing more. The crowd just needed to leave the building. Witches' familiars were actually black cats, specifically a Halloween cutout in a store window, a hunched figure in a pointed hat, and at her feet a sleek black cat, the natural companion of every witch in the popular imagination, going back to the earliest folk tales. The medieval and early modern European belief in familiars, small animal companions thought to assist witches in magic, was real, but it was much broader than the black cat trope suggests. Trial records from the witch hunts in Britain and continental Europe describe familiars in nearly every form available in a household or garden. Dogs, ferrets, toads, mice, rabbits, owls, ravens, hedgehogs, hares, even insects, in some testimonies. The animal species varied widely by region and by the imagination of whoever was making the accusation. Black cats weren't even particularly central in the original folklore. They became prominent later, partly through 19th century literature and stage productions that found the imagery dramatic, and partly through Edgar Allan Poe's short story, The Black Cat, which fixed the association in the popular Anglophone imagination. By the time the trope reached modern Halloween decorations, the cat had been promoted to the witch's primary companion in a way that medieval accusers wouldn't have recognized. So the witch hunts of history were not, in the main, cat hunts. They were a much wider and uglier campaign that swept up any vulnerable person and any small animal that happened to be near them. The black cat was a 19th century costume choice, added to a story that originally had room for almost any creature in the barn. The 5-second rule has scientific backing. Every few years, a news headline circulates suggesting the 5-second rule might actually be real. A university study, the headline says, has found that dropped food picks up less bacteria when retrieved quickly. The rule, it seems, has graduated from kitchen folklore to peer-reviewed science. The studies do exist, and what they've found is much smaller and more conditional than the headlines suggested. Researchers at a handful of universities, including a widely cited Rutgers study in 2016, have measured how much bacteria transfers to food at various time intervals after a drop. They consistently found two things. First, that bacterial transfer happens almost instantaneously on contact, with the largest amount transferring within the first second. Second, that longer contact times do allow slightly more bacteria to accumulate. So in a narrow technical sense, food picked up at 5 seconds carries marginally less bacteria than food picked up at 30 seconds. That isn't the same as the food being safe. The amount of bacteria transferred even in the first second of contact is more than enough to make someone sick if the surface is contaminated with anything pathogenic. The Rutgers researchers were explicit about this. The rule, they concluded, doesn't protect against illness in any meaningful way. The headlines flattened a careful study into a vindication. The actual finding was closer to bacteria are fast, and the flaw is still the flaw. Humans need exactly 8 hours of sleep. The number is everywhere, 8 hours. The unquestioned target, the line on every health pamphlet and sleep tracker app. Hit 8, and you've done your job. Fall below, and you've failed the night. Sleep research consistently finds that adult sleep needs vary substantially from person to person. The range that produces good outcomes for most healthy adults sits between 7 and 9 hours, with some individuals genuinely thriving on slightly less or needing slightly more. A small minority of people carry genetic variants that allow them to function fully on 5 or 6 hours with no apparent cost. Others naturally require 9 or 10 to feel fully rested. Sleep needs also shift across a lifetime. Newborns sleep up to 17 hours a day. Teenagers need closer to 9 or 10. On a delayed schedule, their bodies want to fall asleep later and wake later, biologically, even when school schedules disagree. Older adults often sleep slightly less than middle-aged adults, sometimes in shorter, more fragmented stretches. None of these patterns are deficiencies. They're the normal shape of a sleep need that changes with age. What matters more than hitting 8 hours is consistency going to bed and waking at roughly the same times and waking feeling rested. Someone who sleeps 7 hours and wakes refreshed is sleeping correctly. Someone forcing 9 hours and waking groggy may be oversleeping. The number was always a population average dressed up as a personal prescription. Drinking alcohol warms you up in the cold. A flask passed around in a snowy landscape, a sip taken, a spreading warmth through the chest, and the comforting belief that alcohol is doing exactly what it feels like it's doing, raising the body's temperature against the cold. The sensation is real. The mechanism is the opposite of warming. Alcohol causes blood vessels near the surface of the skin to dilate, which sends warm blood from the body's core out towards the extremities. That sudden rush of warm blood to the skin produces the immediate feeling of heat, particularly in the face, hands, and chest. What's happening underneath the sensation is that the body is now losing heat faster to the cold surrounding air, because the warm blood it would normally keep insulated in the core is now pressed up against the cold, exposed skin. The body's actual core temperature drops as a result. In genuinely cold conditions, this is dangerous. Alcohol's tendency to bring warm blood to the surface, combined with its tendency to impair judgment and physical coordination, makes drunk people significantly more vulnerable to hypothermia. Many cold weather deaths involve alcohol consumption shortly before the body was found. So the flask in the snow is offering a feeling, not a defense. The warmth that spreads through the chest is the warmth that should have stayed inside, leaving on its way out. Polygraph lie detector tests reliably detect lies. A subject hooked up to wires across the chest and fingertips, a series of questions, and a needle that supposedly twitches whenever the truth is being avoided. The polygraph as it appears on television, an objective machine that reads the mind through the body. A polygraph doesn't detect lies. It detects physiological arousal, changes in breathing rate, blood pressure, pulse, and skin conductivity. The underlying assumption is that lying produces measurable stress responses different from those produced by telling the truth. The assumption has never been firmly supported by research. The fundamental problem is that the same physiological changes the polygraph measures also occur for many reasons unrelated to dishonesty. Anxiety about being tested, fear of being falsely accused, embarrassment about a true answer, anger at the line of questioning. Even strong belief in the test itself can produce reactions that look like lying. Skilled liars, particularly those with practice or training, can often pass polygraph tests by remaining calm. Honest people, particularly anxious ones, frequently fail them. The U.S. National Academy of Sciences reviewed the available research in 2003 and concluded that polygraph accuracy was well below what would be acceptable for high-stakes decisions. Most U.S. courts don't admit polygraph results as evidence for this reason. The American Psychological Association has stated there is no consistent evidence that polygraphs can accurately detect lies. What the machine reliably detects is a stressed body. Whether that body is lying is a question the wires were never able to answer. You can catch a cold from being cold. Here is the part of the myth that's almost worth taking seriously before the rest falls apart. The immune system isn't completely indifferent to temperature. Some research suggests that when the temperature of the nasal passages drops as it does in cold weather, when you breathe in cold air for a long stretch, certain immune defenses in those tissues become slightly less effective. The cells that normally produce antiviral signals work a little more slowly. The rhinoviruses that cause most colds happen to replicate slightly more efficiently at those lower temperatures too. So in theory, cold air in the nose creates conditions a hair more favorable to a virus that's already present. That's the entire mechanism, and it depends entirely on the virus being there in the first place. If you stand in freezing air for an hour and no rhinovirus has been near you, you don't catch a cold. The cold air doesn't generate the virus. It can only slightly, marginally tilt the odds when a virus is already in your environment, encountered through someone coughing nearby, a doorknob, a shared hand. So the version of the myth that survives any close examination is this much smaller claim. Cold exposure may very slightly increase your odds of succumbing to a virus you would have encountered anyway. The version that says the cold itself produces the illness out of thin air was always wrong. The virus had to come from somewhere. The temperature was only ever the closing margin. Centrifugal force is a real outward force. A car takes a sharp curve. The passengers slide towards the outside of the turn, and the explanation that follows is that something is pushing them outward, a centrifugal force, throwing them away from the center of the curve. Nothing is pushing them outward. The thing that's actually happening is more elegant and a little stranger. When the car turns, the car is changing direction. The passengers, by Newton's first law, would prefer to keep going in a straight line. They have no reason on their own to follow the curve. What forces them around the turn is the seat and the door pressing inward against their bodies, redirecting their motion along the new arc. From the perspective of someone standing outside the car watching from above, the passengers are being pushed inward, not outward. The only outward thing in the scene is their natural tendency to go straight, which the car is overriding. The sensation of being pushed outward is real to anyone inside the car, because the world is moving around them and they're being pressed sideways by the seat. Physicists call this a fictitious force, something that feels real from inside an accelerating reference frame, but doesn't exist as an actual push from anywhere in the universe. What's called centrifugal force is the body's experience of being forced to do something it didn't intend to do. It just isn't, technically, a thing pushing back. Your appendix and tonsils serve no purpose at all. For most of the 20th century, surgeons treated the appendix as a useless leftover, a vestigial organ, inherited from some long-ago ancestor whose diet required it, now serving only as an occasional source of dangerous inflammation. Tonsils were viewed similarly. Both were routinely removed at the first sign of trouble, sometimes prophylactically, on the assumption that nothing of value was being lost. More recent research has complicated that picture considerably. The appendix is now believed to play a role in the immune system, particularly during early life, and to act as a kind of reservoir for beneficial gut bacteria. After events like severe gastrointestinal illness that wipe out the gut's microbial population, the appendix may help repopulate the intestines with healthy bacteria from its protected reserves. People without an appendix do fine in modern medical conditions, but the organ isn't sitting idle when it's present. Tonsils, similarly, are part of the body's first-line immune defense against infections entering through the mouth and throat. They contain lymphoid tissue that helps recognize and respond to incoming pathogens. Their value is highest in childhood, when the immune system is still learning what to defend against, which is partly why tonsillectomies became less routine over the decades as the research caught up. Neither organ is essential. Both can be removed without long-term catastrophe. But the older idea that they were biological junk has been quietly retired. The body was never carrying around organs for no reason. It was just that no one had asked the right questions yet. Einstein was a poor student his whole life. The story expanded over the years from a math myth into a broader one, that Einstein was an indifferent student in general, scraping by in classes, dropping out of school, working as a humble patent clerk because no university would have him, and then somehow producing world-changing physics out of nowhere. The actual record is much more conventional than the legend. Einstein had some friction with the rigid Prussian school system. As a teenager, he found rote memorization tedious, clashed with at least one teacher who reportedly told him he would never amount to anything, and left the gymnasium in Munich before completing it. None of this reflected poor ability. He was already, at that age, working through advanced mathematics and physics on his own. He passed the entrance exam for the Swiss Federal Polytechnic on his second try, after initially being too young, and graduated with respectable grades. His difficulty after graduation wasn't because no one thought he was capable. It was because he had clashed with some of his professors enough that none of them would write him a recommendation letter for an academic position. The patent office in Bern was a fallback job, taken because the academic doors had closed personally rather than intellectually. While working at that patent office, in 1905, he produced 4 papers in a single year that reshaped physics, including the theory of special relativity and the equation that became E equals mc squared. The patent job left him time to think. The work that followed wasn't the surprise emergence of a bad student. It was the long-deferred output of someone who had been ready for years. Lemmings follow each other off cliffs in mass suicides. Pop culture is full of references to lemmings flinging themselves off cliffs in mindless waves, a metaphor for blind conformity, a critique of crowd behavior, a phrase casually thrown into editorials. The implication is that lemmings really do this, that the suicidal march is a real animal behavior somewhere in the Arctic. Lemmings don't commit mass suicide. They don't fling themselves off cliffs. They are small Arctic rodents that, like many small mammals, undergo dramatic population booms and crashes. When their numbers spike, food becomes scarce, and large groups of lemmings migrate in search of new territory. During those migrations, some lemmings inevitably drown trying to swim across rivers or lakes that turn out to be too wide. Others die from predation or exhaustion. None of this is suicide. It's the ordinary cost of a desperate migration. The cliff-jumping image was given enormous staying power, by a 1958 Disney nature documentary called White Wilderness. The filmmakers wanted dramatic footage. Lemmings on their own weren't willing to provide it. So the documentary crew imported lemmings to a location that wasn't even their natural habitat, herded them off a cliff into a river using a rotating turntable, and filmed the result. The footage looked exactly like a mass suicide. It was staged. A myth that had simmered for decades was set in concrete by a single fraudulent piece of footage. The lemmings in the wild were just trying to find food. The ones on screen had been pushed. The Boy Who Cried Wolf story has only one accepted version/moral. We end on something quieter, because not every myth is about science or animals or kings. Some are about the stories themselves and how the versions we inherit aren't always the only ones that ever existed. The Boy Who Cried Wolf, as most people know it, is an Aesop's fable. A shepherd boy raises false alarms about a wolf for amusement. The villagers stop believing him. A real wolf eventually arrives, and no one comes to help. The moral, as it's typically taught, is about the cost of lying. Liars aren't believed even when they finally tell the truth. That's one version, and it's the dominant one in English language tradition. It isn't the only one. Some older versions of the fable end with the boy being eaten by the wolf. Some end with the sheep being eaten while the boy survives. Some versions emphasize the villager's failure rather than the boy's, the moral being that adults shouldn't be so quick to abandon a child in danger, even one who has lied before. Some retellings in different cultures shift the lesson toward community responsibility, or towards the loneliness of being a young shepherd entrusted with a job too large for him. Some versions soften the ending considerably, with the boy surviving and learning a humbler lesson. The neat moral most of us were taught is a flattening. Like a lot of stories that have traveled for thousands of years, the fable has had many shapes, and the one that survived in modern textbooks is just the version that happened to be most useful to the people printing them. A lot of what we know, it turns out, is like that. Not entirely wrong. Just one version among many, repeated long enough to sound like the only one.